Hi everyone, I'm Ali Aslan, international TV presenter and journalist, and it's my great pleasure to host this session titled Corona Destabilizer or Catalyst for Quality Media. This session is being brought to you by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and together with three international journalists, we want to look at the effects that the pandemic has had on media and journalists worldwide. I'm very delighted to be joined by Mila Serafimova. She's an associate professor of journalism at Sofia University in Bulgaria. Also with us is US-based Chinese journalist Shen Lu. And last but certainly not least, delighted to welcome Kenyan journalist and documentary filmmaker joining us from Nairobi, Asha Mwilu. Welcome to the three of you, and let's dive right into the subject matter because there's lots to talk about, obviously. Shen, if we look at the effects of the pandemic on the quality of media output, obviously there's been more demand, if you will, than ever for trustworthy, fact-based journalism, because literally this was about life and death. Getting the right information, getting the right facts was about life and death. Do you think that the pandemic, as dismal and unfortunate as it is, of course, has led to perhaps a newfound appreciation for quality journalism out there?
Yes, I do. And that's a great question. I have been monitoring the news coverage coming out of Asia of the pandemic since the very beginning, since the outbreak of the coronavirus in Wuhan, China, which is where I come from. And at the beginning, we saw a pleasant surge of quality journalism coverage and investigative stories coming out of Wuhan by Chinese journalists working for commercial media in China and independent media in China. They really surprised a lot of us who are Chinese media observers, because they were able to went to Wuhan and uncover the story of the delayed response, government response, and the situation of lockdown in Wuhan. That was a brief window of free journalism, so-called free journalism in China, which where in a country where media is heavily censored. And we also saw a surge of social media use on Weibo, which is the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. I talked to a professor in Hong Kong who tracks censorship on Weibo, and he told me that an increasing number of users went on Weibo to seek help and to look for accurate information out there. And that's also the same in India as well. I talked to the editor-in-chief of an independent publication called Caravan, and Jose Vinod, and he told me that their subscription during the pandemic, it's an independent investigative magazine, and I'm so glad to see quality journalism thrives in the pandemic.
Right, absolutely. More needed than ever. Mila, you are a professor of journalism and communication. Certainly, you have scouted the international performance, if you will, on the part of many colleagues in the midst of this pandemic. And there's a lot of pressure. There's been a lot of pressure on journalists to get the story right, to get the facts straight. Do you think that journalists, by and large, have risen to the occasion?
Yes, the truth is that COVID-19 made the existing problems in the media environment of Southeast Europe more visible. As a magnifying glass, the epidemic made the shortcomings in the functioning of the media in the region not only more visible, but also more serious. COVID-19 is a catalyst of some negative changes in Southeast European media, but in the same time, it's a catalyst of the digital media transformation and quality media impact. In September, the topic of COVID-19 no longer brings positives for anyone, neither for politicians nor for the media. media inform less and less about it. They receive statistical data, but not positions and statements from the responsible state institutions and the government. Political leaders lately prefer to remain silent as well. COVID-19 is no longer a favorite topic because it accumulates mostly negatives and hostility among the audience. For this reason, the topic is gradually falling out of the media agenda in the summer, thus violating the right to complete and objective information. Everyone is tired and doesn't want to listen more about COVID-19. And this public attitude doesn't stimulate in-depth media coverage. The quality of media output during the corona pandemic was influenced in a negative way by fake news as well. The boom of fake news at the beginning of the epidemic in March resulted in a decline in the media trust at a later stage. What are the negative phenomena in September in Southeast Europe? On one hand, there is still fake news about the disease and COVID-19 health measures. On the other hand, governments attempt to control the media coverage, or even worse, to neglect the subject because it leads to an explosion of the tired of the COVID-19 news. Protests against measures to control the epidemic are widespread in the Balkans, for example. Kosovo government coalition resigned. In Bulgaria, there are anti-government protests already for 2 months. This led to a restriction of communication on the topic by the responsible state institutions. So we are wondering, is this phenomenon of silence about COVID-19 going to be the new normal?
Indeed.
And we will see next month.
Yeah, indeed,
Yes.
indeed. You've raised many important points, some of which we will get into, of course, in further detail. And yes, there might be fatigueness, if you will, on the part of consumers to read and hear about COVID-19, that's for certain. But nonetheless, journalists have to be relentless, obviously, in providing the facts so that we're all safe and sound. Asha, we heard from Europe, Eastern Europe, we heard from Asia. You're based in Nairobi, Kenya. How would you rate the performance on the part of the media and journalists in times of a pandemic in Africa?
Thank you for the question and for having me. I think similarly, just in every part of the world, COVID-19 has affected media in Kenya in a very similar way. So for us, we kind of had a head start on this story because while coronavirus was spreading, out of Asia and into European countries and America, it hadn't really hit Africa. So in the newsrooms, we kind of had a bit of time to, prepare for this coverage. But I think there's been two effects, so the positives and the negatives. Let me start with the negatives, that many people have lost their job. COVID-19 has affected the African economies, and so one of the industries that have been hard hit is the journalism, news, media industry. And we've seen massive layoffs of crucial journalists from our newsrooms. On the positives, I think, healthcare and health reporting in this region has always been considered sort of of news. And so it was really refreshing for once to see, mainstream media step away from the usual political coverage into, health reporting and going deeper to discuss things that affect the everyday man, because that's usually very rare unless a health story is attached to a big investigation or a political issue. We don't usually see health reporting sustained in the way that it has been during coronavirus.
Very interesting points that you raised there, both the positive and the negative. And you've mentioned, of course, correctly, the economic effects that COVID-19 has had on journalism, Shen Lu. Obviously, it seems a bit paradox and ironic, isn't it? At a time when good journalism, quality journalism is needed more than ever, ad revenues are down, budget cuts all across, there are cuts in staff. And many of the outlets, particularly newspapers, already, of course, were already in a difficult financial situation even before the pandemic. On the bright side, though, do you see that this might be an opportunity, if you will, for new creative ways to produce news and do journalism? That reinvention here is very much needed in order to overcome the financial difficulties that many media outlets are facing.
It's encouraging to see that the number of independent news outlets that are financially not entirely relying on ad revenues or big corporation money are thriving over the pandemic. That shows us that good quality journalism and investigative journalism has its market. And the number of independent publications that I've talked to in Asia all have seen rising subscription numbers, and that's very great news. But but those publications are all subscription based, meaning that their readers are willing to pay for a subscription to get the quality news they want. And yes, indeed, it's encouraging in that front that more people are willing to subscribe to pay for their news. But more mainstream and legacy media that rely more financially on ad revenues.
Of course, digitalization, Mila, is the word of the day, the word of the month, the word of the year, if you will, meaning there's no way anymore to stall. You need to digitalize in order to get ahead. Journalism certainly is not exempt from it. Quite on the contrary, what we've seen is during this pandemic, a phenomenon called distributed newsrooms, meaning obviously a home office versus physical newsroom. And we've seen a lot of journalists are being able or forced, if you will, to perform their job outside of the newsroom. Do you think that the pandemic is accelerating a renewal process that perhaps was long overdue anyway?
Yes, I think that just a few months ago, the media recorded an impressive audience growth, and people have consumed 24 hours, 7 days per week, huge portions of news content, mainly online. This urgent search for information stimulated and intensified the news production for COVID-19, and print publications were transformed in their digital format. So at this point, the theory of infodemia emerged, that we have to survive not only pandemia, but infodemia as well. And in the social media, people started to blame media that they earn profit through COVID-19 news. Conspiracy theories emerged as well about kind of secret agreement between governments, international organizations, and media to create a global crisis. In the same time, media have suffered from a sharp drop in advertising and sales, and as a consequence to disastrous financial losses, and the print media were most affected. Lack of advertising revenue has forced media in Southeast Europe to support government's efforts to restart the economy despite the disease. And from one extreme, plenty of information about the coronavirus. They moved to other extremes, started to neglect the topic in the name of the economic growth. As my colleague told, some journalists lost their job. Some were forced to take a paid or even unpaid leave or to work with reduced salaries. And all these actions were presented as part of the anti-epidemic measures and as actions against the economic difficulties during the lockdown. Unfortunately, some media owners and even public media managers have used COVID-19 and took advantage of it to rid off and fire journalists. Media owners receive state support from the financial funds for COVID-19 to pay journalistic salaries, and in this way, COVID-19 compensation mechanism make them more dependable from the governments and their financial aid. And as a general observation, small media suffer more than big media. Regional media are in more difficult situation during COVID-19 than national ones. And print media are hit more than TV, radio, and online media. they transform their content in digital one. Instead of every day, because of the coronavirus, some regional media are printed 2 or 3 times a week. And in Southeast Europe, only small part of the media exists on a market basis through subscription, advertisement, and sales, and they suffer of market turbulence during COVID-19.
Right.
The rest of the media, yes, rely on fixed subsidies.
Yeah, for sure. And many of the changes that you have pointed out, of course, are in full display. And again, there's no way around digitalization now. I think even the last person now, even the most old-fashioned person, if you will, has realized that under normal circumstances, the four of us would probably be on a live stage in Berlin right now, talking about the state of journalism as it is. Here we are talking on a digital platform. Asha.
Yes.
But I do, the digitalization, the aspect, I do want to bring it up again and get your perspective on it. Do you think that the necessity for it and the inevitability, if you will, for it has been recognized also in Kenya and Africa?
I think certainly so, especially for my region, where a lot of audience are still on relying on mainstream platforms. What coronavirus did was become a catalyst for digitization, and not just for journalists working from home and giving those opportunities that the digital platform gives to our workflow, but it's beyond that. And I'm testament to that. I'm a good example of that because I've worked in mainstream television for 10 years. And when the coronavirus pandemic hit Kenya in mid-March, I was still working in the newsroom in the biggest TV station in Kenya. I covered coronavirus for 2 months, and I did see the opportunities that digitization presented, and moved out and founded an independent media house on July 1st. I think what we've seen is just the opportunity for things like pluralism of news. Most of the legacy media houses in Kenya and a lot of other African countries are either state-owned or closely linked to political actors. The other thing is just independence of news, independence of media. I think coronavirus has become a catalyst to also show audiences that there is a big opportunity to scale up on digital content, on consuming news on the digital platform. And for me, I jumped straight at looking at those opportunities and tapping into them. It was a bit of a risk, but I do see those opportunities as much as, yes, we're having questions on what will the business model be. Will the digitization be sustainable for independent platforms online? I do think that it's such an opportunity to fight some of the things that journalism seeks to fight. If I could just finish that point by saying, like in Kenya, one of the biggest problems that journalism faces on the online platform is misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and social media platforms that are popular in the region, like WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, are sometimes harbor like the biggest, that they become the biggest platforms for fake news. And so having public interest, fact-based organizations that are driving such content on the online platform is certainly like just a breath of fresh air. So I do feel like COVID-19 has been a catalyst for pluralism, a bit of freedom of media, and just giving audiences a different taste of what to expect in the new era of journalism.
No doubt about that. Nonetheless, though, Shen Lu, and you've alluded to this in one of your previous answers, unfortunately, what we've also seen is that the pandemic has, if you will, in some countries and regions anyway, undermined press freedom. Some leaders, authoritarian leaders, have used COVID-19 as a pretext, as an excuse to come down hard on journalists and impose censorship and control. Share us a little bit about the experience that you personally perhaps have experienced, or some of your colleagues in Asia and China in particular.
So I personally haven't experienced censorship because I'm not based in China and I don't work for a Chinese news outlet, but I know that a lot of my colleagues working for Chinese news outlets have experienced that. There was an interesting, short, brief period of so-called press freedom in China right after when the pandemic when the epidemic hit Wuhan, a lot of the journalists were able to go into Wuhan and get firsthand information, which was quite remarkable. But then censorship shortly after that period, censorship kicked in immediately. And we also, now that we know that Dr. Li Wenliang is internationally known as a whistleblower who spread the information about a possible, an unknown disease that was spreading around in Wuhan on social media. And after his unfortunate death, there was actually a call for press freedom online and offline, which is quite rare in China. And so in that sense, I think the censorship also has been met with resistance from the audience, from the people.
Yeah, and some unfortunate cases, such as in the Philippines, for instance, internationally acclaimed journalist Maria Ressa, for instance, has been sentenced to jail because of her reporting. Very dismal and unfortunate incident indeed. Mila, how do you observe? How have you been observing the tendency on the part of authoritarian leaders in Europe to use this pandemic, if you will, to impose censorship and control on journalism and free flow of information?
At a time when a free, reliable, and responsible media which works in public interest is more important than ever, governments in East Europe are increasingly taking advantage of emergency legislation aimed at tackling the coronavirus to push through restrictions which seriously erode press freedom. In March, for example, the Romanian government has passed a number of emergency decrees that affect freedom of expression and access to information, and allow authorities to issue takedown orders on articles and websites accused of spreading false information about the pandemic. In March, authorities in Bosnia-Herzegovina introduced tentative new measures against spreading panic and fake news regarding the coronavirus outbreak in a move that could impede the free work of journalists and their ability to report on the pandemic. In Bulgaria, as well, in mid-March, the parliament has adopted a state of emergency law. This also included stricter action against false news. Their spread should result in a prison sentence of up to 3 years and a fine of up to 5,000 euros. Against this part of the law, however, President of the country heard his veto. The reason was that since no definition of fake news was formulated, there is a danger of self-censorship and a restriction of freedom of expression. So the parliament then removed this section in the law. But we are still looking forward, and we should be very careful about such advantages of the emergency situation.
Indeed. Asha, what about Kenya and press freedom in times of COVID-19? What can you share with us?
I think for Kenya, it's again just been it's been like two stories again. For instance, the positive of it is that the fact that government officials had to give a press briefing every single day and give data on the coronavirus numbers. It seems to be an advancement in open data, because this is something that's never been seen before. We've not seen governments coming out clearly to give the public data on such an issue of public. But for many countries around the region, Eastern and Southern Africa, we have seen a bit of authoritarianism cropping up of the pandemic. In Tanzania, for example, where President Magufuli told his people that coronavirus doesn't exist, he refused to give data to the WHO and any other World Health organization like the CDC. He refused to share any data on coronavirus. On top of that, he has passed legislations that deem detrimental to freedom of press. So, for instance, Tanzania recently passed a bill that requires anyone to share content with the government before publishing it. And so this is just seen as a complete infringement of press freedom and freedom freedom of association, freedom of expression for even the members of the public. In Zimbabwe, we also know of a top investigative journalist called Hopewell Chinono, who has been arrested and is still in jail because of covering a COVID-related story. And it was a story that was an investigative story that was revealing government corruption of COVID-19 funds. So we have seen some of those cases of authoritarianism creeping up and very detrimental to freedom of press. Even in Ethiopia, where the prime minister very recently won a Nobel Prize, we have seen more arrests now cropping up during the coronavirus period, including of a Kenyan journalist who was only recently released after contracting coronavirus while in jail. So it's really been, two sides of a story. On one hand, it's been really great for open data and seeing governments sharing this data, a lot of African governments, but on the other hand, we have seen a bit of the authoritarianism cropping up.
Sure, certainly a mixed bag then there, from what I'm hearing. I think we are all in agreement, and you certainly have all confirmed this, that the media and journalists, they do have to adapt in order to survive in a post-pandemic world, whenever that may be, hopefully sooner than later. Obviously, Shen Lu, what changes do you think that have been emerging since the pandemic do you think will outlast the pandemic in the field of media and journalism? What changes that we have seen throughout the past 6-7 months do you think are permanent?
I think one major change for journalists based in the US is that we are adapting to the working from home mode. And I think it's true for journalists elsewhere too. We're all remote working. I don't know how long this kind of work situation will last, but certainly people are getting used to working from home and realizing that it's not necessary that everybody goes to the newsroom to work on stories. And I think, and I hope that the subscription-based independent news outlets will continue to get their more subscribers and continue to produce the long-form journalism, which is in the mainstream media landscape, and still be able to survive even post-pandemic. And I'm hopeful that people are yearning for more accurate facts and more in-depth analysis of news events going forward.
Yeah, indeed. As we said, hopefully a newly gained appreciation for quality journalism out there, Mila. Looking past the pandemic, as dangerous as it may be in times like these, but just for theoretical purposes, what do you think? What is journalism, what is media going to look like in a post-pandemic world?
I think the worst consequence of the COVID-19 crisis for the Southeast European media and the global media environment can be the philosophy of survival to prevail over the understanding of freedom and independence of the media. But there are positive consequences as well, that COVID-19 has taught people to look for credible information provided by quality media. It became clear that sensational media can be dangerous for our health. So for me, this is a positive consequence from COVID-19. And the hope for a positive scenario in post-COVID-19 world comes from the media with quality content, a quick reflex to the new technologies, and high professionalism. The crisis will be successfully overcome by those media who are still able to tell the truth about what is happening in public interest, I think.
Very well summarized, I think. Many important points that you have laid out for journalists to survive and flourish in the future. Asha, before we wrap up, let's also get your take about how journalism in a post-pandemic world can and should look like in order to succeed.
I foresee that data journalism is really going to take precedence, and rightfully so. I think audiences are yearning for explanatory, in-depth journalism, quality journalism, as one of the panelists has said. But my fear for Kenya and for the region, and it's a fear that we're already seeing sort of like bubbling under, is retrogressive legislation that seeks to muzzle, the freedom of expression, especially on the digital platform. And I think, because coronavirus has shown audiences that being connected, that internet equality is very important, that governments might perhaps attempt to, bring those countries backwards. So that, because unfortunately politics still rules, and we are going to a very deeply political season for a lot of the countries in the region, going towards their general elections. So it's a hope that quality journalism will prevail, but a fear that government interference and attempts to muzzle the press and the digital freedom might also prevail.
Corona, destabilizer or catalyst for quality media, ? That's the question that we have set out to answer. And listening to our three wonderful panelists and journalists, I think it's clear that there's not a yes or no. It's both. It's a destabilizer and can be a catalyst if used properly, if those opportunities that have arisen since the pandemic can be seized accordingly. Mila Serafimova, Asha Mwilu, and Shen Lu, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for your wonderful inputs. Hopefully next time we meet, it'll be in person again, wherever that may be. Thanks for joining. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for having me.